Hello and welcome everybody. Welcome to Break the Chains and Fight Against Human Trafficking. I am Sergeant Alanis with the Harris County Sheriff's Office. I am over one of the human trafficking units. Beside me is...
I'm Azuli Sosa. I'm a victim advocate for the Sheriff's Office, and I tend to respond on scene and to calls from victims.
I'm Deputy Hager. I am a human trafficking investigator, and I investigate possible human trafficking throughout the Harris County area.
The purpose of this live stream is to educate and advise the community of human trafficking awareness. Today, January the 11th, is National Human Trafficking Awareness Day, and we are showing our support by wearing blue. Deputy Hager, can you tell us what is human trafficking?
Human trafficking is when a victim is targeted by a trafficker, and they are forced, coerced, or frauded into performing labor services or commercial sex acts.
Can you tell us what is the difference between human trafficking and human smuggling?
Human smuggling is transportation based. So people go and pick up victims from the border and bring them into the United States. And human trafficking is when the person is forced to do labor or sex services for monetary gain. Mm-hmm. Now, sometimes human smuggling can turn into human trafficking, but that's not always the case. There is differences.
Right. Once that person is exploited, it can turn from smuggling because of the act that they are forced to do, sometimes to repay debts or because of threats.
Just want to reiterate, most of our victims are domestic. They're not from overseas or whatever. It is happening here in our local communities. When we speak to our victims, we like to reiterate that we are not immigration. We are not seeking to know their status of citizenship. Okay. Deputy Hager, can you tell us some methods that are used to lure victims?
Yeah, false promises of jobs, romantic relationships, violence, manipulation. A vast majority of our victims are lured and groomed from social media. They first meet their traffickers on social media, and that is how the traffickers get their victims the majority of the time.
Thank you. Can you tell us why victims are afraid to come out and say that they're victims?
A lot of victims don't self-identify as victims. They believe that they're in a relationship with their traffickers. They believe that their position with their traffickers are better sometimes than where they came from. And then sometimes it's because they're afraid of the police. They are afraid if they're here on an illegal status, they're afraid that they're going to be sent back to where they came, where they're from, and the traffickers will groom their victims into coming up and having a story on what's going on. So they don't have a lot of confidence in coming out as a victim because of it.
A lot of times, too, I want to lean in and say that when a person becomes victimized for trafficking, they often have a lack of community and social nets. And as well, it's often referred to as a hidden crime because of the lack of coming forward. There's often a lot of shame involved or some fear. If it's not from fear against law enforcement, it might be fear against retribution to themselves or to their loved ones, or to just a scattered reputation.
How can we identify a victim of human trafficking? What are some of the signs?
Some of the signs that we've seen, especially with juveniles, is girls having money just out of nowhere, like having their nails done, having their hair done, having a secondary phone or a new phone. Branding is also a big one, which when I say branding, I mean tattoos. Vast majority of the time they're going to be with the names of their traffickers or their nicknames or symbols like crowns. Somebody who refuses to make eye contact, somebody who doesn't speak a lot.
We're also well aware at the Sheriff's Office that a lot of time the behavior of these survivors is not what you would expect from someone that you would traditionally call a victim, because the situation that they're in creates a psychology for survival. And if they see their best interest is listening to that trafficker instead of reaching out for help, sometimes we'll see them as distant or unresponsive or even combative, as they've been called. So.
Thank you. How can we prevent victims from being trafficked?
I would say to pay closer attention. Like, if your child's behavior suddenly changes, if they're running away more often, question, look through their phones, especially with the juveniles. I know it's a little harder with the adults, but if you have a suspicion that something's not right, that something's going on, question.
And this goes a lot too for a lot of businesses in our communities. If you feel like there's just something not right, even if it's not trafficking, you still may end up being the person to tip about some unfair labor situations.
Parents should know their kids are on social media and they should follow them, know who their kids' friends are and who they hang out with and where, so they know what their sons, kids, daughters are doing at all times. Ms. Azuli, can you discuss how Houston ranks, the Houston and Harris County rank in human trafficking?
Unfortunately, at this time, Harris County and Houston District ranks as highest, if not one of the highest locations for both labor and sex trafficking. I want to say that there's a lot of misconception, since we are a state that borders another country, that and you touched the subject a little bit earlier when you mentioned that a lot of our victims are here domestically. That's true. A lot of the victims that we do help recuperate are juveniles from Houston, from Texas, from the United States. But because we are a transportation hub with access to the port and highways that go to all of the other states nearby, a lot of people come to Texas and come to Houston to commit these crimes.
Can you tell us what the Sheriff's Office is doing to reduce human trafficking?
At this time, the Sheriff's Office is part of the Houston, Texas and Human Trafficking Prevention Task Force with HATRA and other groups. We want to work locally to try and keep up with all research, publications, and reports to then develop our trainings on. We want to keep a new kind of mentality where we keep evolving once we get this information. We want our deputies to have the mentality to empathize and to not ignore these warning signs, even though it might be difficult. And you might have multiple run-ins with survivors. It might not always be the first time that they're willing to speak with you. And we
The Sheriff's
learn
Office
from
also,
survivors,
excuse me.
too.
Yeah, the Sheriff's Office is also part of a task force, the Human Trafficking Rescue Alliance,
Yes.
where we've partnered up with other law enforcement agencies all around the Houston area, federal agencies, and we help each other to corroborate the stories. We don't do double the work.
We also want to try and minimize as much the re-traumatization process for survivors.
Ms. Courtney has joined us, and she's a survivor, and she would like to share her story.
Thank you, Sergeant, and thank you all of the Harris County Sheriff's Office for being one of our #1 law enforcement partners. I am so proud to be here on behalf of Houston-based No Trafficking Zone. I am the Director of Survivor Initiatives and a former member of the President's U.S. Advisory Council, serving under the past 2 administrations, and I'm a Houston native, so for so many reasons, it is a pleasure to be here with you all for this important discussion.
Thank you.
So much.
So what I would really love to highlight is focusing on the teachable moments. In a survivor leader's testimony as a lived experience expert, there is so much sensationalism and so many things that happen, and part of what I want and I know is God's purpose for everything that I have been through is to dispel stereotypes and stigmas surrounding this crime, because one of the number one issues and something that I experienced when I was being trafficked is victims do not and cannot self-identify as victims of trafficking, whether that's labor, sex, and there are so many other forms of trafficking. But how did this happen to me in Harris County, where we are today? And it all began at my high school, actually, in one of the top school districts. I was so fortunate to have an overall really strong upbringing in a Christian household. Grew up in one of the suburbs of Houston, and I was very fortunate to be very involved in the community. People knew me as everybody's friend and so outgoing. I was involved in extracurricular activities. And something that you touched on that I love, I do not look like what I've been through. So many victims and survivors do not look like what they've been through, but that's why we have to catch up with how much human trafficking has evolved, even since it took place at my high school. Less than 10 years ago. We have to evolve with understanding the psychological aspect and component in the warfare that traffickers breed and program us in human trafficking. And that began as people befriending me at my school who were fellow peers, athletes, seemingly harmless, but so sinister.
It's those false promises of some sort of kinship.
And it begins a lot of times as false promises. And one of the number one forms of trafficking, and one of the many ways I was trafficked, is what's referred to as the Romeo and boyfriend pimp / trafficker, where they present themselves as a loving guardian who is going to come in and be everything to meet all of your current needs. They cater the way that they begin to groom you and build that trust. They find out what are your vulnerabilities, because everybody has something that makes them vulnerable. But what I love is talking to some of my survivor sisters and brothers. They don't like that to be the focal point. I was vulnerable, so I was trafficked. No, that doesn't give somebody the right to traffic somebody, but it helps us understand when we can get inside the mind of a trafficker / pimp, which also we need pimping prevention, and to get to the root causes of what makes victims and survivors vulnerable, communities, families, but also families and individuals who become traffickers and pimps. Because my first trafficker from my school was a student and a graduated student from my high school. And as I progressed and didn't realize I was being lured and entrapped deeper and deeper by means of social media with force, fraud, and coercion. Through Instagram, through Snapchat were the number one social media sites that were used. And I was in fact being groomed and approached by multiple trafficking networks from my school district at the same time. So it is so complex, and when survivors share their lived experience, that's one of the things I'm so thankful we're able to do in our discussion today, is to be able to help people understand how this happens in real time, and also all the value and expertise that all survivor leaders, lived experience experts, advocates, legislators, members of Congress, law enforcement advocates have done over the past nearly 2 decades since the TVPA was originally passed in 2000. We've come such a long way, but since I was just trafficked in the last 10 years, it is so important, and I'm so grateful to be able to contribute very fresh, relevant information so we can partner that, so we can get ahead of this crime and stop chasing it and be proactive. And so although there's many horror stories and terrible things I can share that happened even minutes away from here in Harris County, I like to focus on the teachable moments. And so after being approached and groomed at my high school, I was introduced to other students and people who were involved in many different forms of organized crime. And that's one of the things I know we talked about earlier, is how this intersects with so many different crime areas and different things going on in our communities. But if you can understand human trafficking and where I've been able to come to since doing so much healing and trauma work, and just the human brain and body is capable of so much. And that's one of the things that this has taught me, and I'm grateful to shine a light on it.
From the teachable moments that you're giving
Yes.
us these insights for, what do you think should be the focus for other people who want to seek recovery?
Yes, well, one of the things is also dispelling shame, unfair shame. There is so much guilt and a code of silence with victims, even before they're trafficked, but while they're being groomed. And that's one of the things I'm so passionate about. And NTZ and our other partners, we've gone into schools, we've worked with students, and we talk to parents, and we're like, we want to bridge these gaps now that social media and technology has evolved so much. And one of those big teachable moments is realizing victims and juveniles, especially, and students in schools, will go and put in more effort to cover up something that's happening to them because they're being told they're a bad kid, they're a bad student, they're a bad individual, but it's the behavior. And if we could really look at that behavior, and instead of saying that's a bad kid and judging them a book by its cover, if we were able to meet victims and people where they're at, even before they're in trafficking, and listen and say, what are your needs? Because they may not be able, especially when they're juvenile, they can't fully advocate for themselves, but their voice needs to be included.
There needs to be a more social network for our youth as well.
Absolutely.
So that they know that when they come forward, they're not immediately going to be put back down, blamed
Yes,
for
yes.
the situation in which they found themselves.
Yes, and a lot of that guilt and shame comes from the place of the trafficker breeding into them. Not only do they make you fully dependent on them, but they start to break down your self-esteem, your self-worth, so that you have none. Because everything that they have in their mind is transactional. When you're thinking that you love this person and that they love you, they're thinking profit, transaction, power, and control. And a lot of people talk about the money aspect, and a lot of our world in corrupt places, money does speak and run a lot of things, but power and control go hand in hand with greed. In human trafficking, it is not only fueled, traffickers are not only fueled by greed, but being able to control and have power and ownership over another human being.
What resources did you use to get out of being trafficked?
Yes, so a lot of the time, victims are unaware, including myself when this happened to me, of available resources. And that's one of the great things, and in our partnership with the Harris County Sheriff's Office, is putting the word out there that resources do exist, because when this happened to me, there unfortunately, and I know we talked about this earlier too, there's a lot of wonderful law enforcement, but then there's corrupt and bad law enforcement, and as there is good and bad in all things. But when I was going through this, I unfortunately had very negative experiences with law enforcement where I was treated as the freaking criminal. When I was working as a high school student, there was an open investigation of C-SPAM, child sexual abuse material. And that is actually what ended up putting me on the radar of my first traffickers. And so when I reached out for resources, and I reached out to the school resource officers, I unfortunately, when my trafficker was telling me not to trust them and that they were judging me and they would never accept me and that I was the one in the wrong in their eyes, that was unfortunately reaffirmed. When law enforcement didn't tell me my available resources and in fact berated me and put me down and further fed those lies from the trafficker, even if that wasn't their intention, but that's why trauma-informed and trauma-responsive training is so important.
Could you tell us a little bit more about that training?
Yes, well now the state mandates that we take more classes for every peace officer. We go to our stations and advise our patrolmen what to look for, the signs of the victims, and also how they're doing it, so we can get dispatch out there and try to
We try to
help
go
them
to
out
as
more
many
often.
trainings as we can to try and keep up with any publications at the federal, state, or local levels so that we know, we hear about these experiences and we learn from your voices.
Can you reiterate how we or you help out our victims?
Yes, so the victim advocates at the Sheriff's Office, we have victims advocates for many different crimes, but specifically for human trafficking, when we report onto the scene, we deal with adults and juveniles. We from all aspects of life, and we try to immediately figure out what we should do for crisis planning, essentially. There are resources for legal advice, legal help, financial assistance, immediate necessities like food and shelter and clothing. But most of all, the first thing we usually do is we try to figure out if the victim or survivor needs medical assistance. If they don't need emergency medical assistance, we do offer forensic interviews so that they don't have to continue to relive their experiences. And that way the investigators from multiple different branches of law enforcement can just listen into that interview one time, and they don't have to keep forcing this victim to speak about something that's so difficult for them. Myself, I know that I can connect people to resources like the CVC, the Crime Victims Compensation Fund. And from that, they can help with some medical expenses, perhaps relocation. It really opens a lot of doors for people who feel trapped, like they can't do anything, because a lot of things branching from that psychological control also then goes into financial control, where they live, how they can get around, transportation. So we try to supplement where we can, and then of course we work with our local partners.
Yeah, one of those partners, again, is part of being part of a task force, the Human Trafficking Rescue Alliance. Again, working with other agencies, federal, local, also with the NGOs, the non-government entities. So, yes, can you explain on how these people can get assistance, websites, phone numbers?
Yes. So if you don't feel like making a police report, there are other options for you. The National Human Trafficking Hotline is 24/7, available to anyone at 1-888-373-7888. And they also have the website at humantraffickinghotline.org. If you can't make a phone call or are too afraid to be heard, you can also text "Be Free" or "Help" to 233-733. And if it's an emergency, of course, dial 911. If you want more information about all of that we've talked about, you can probably rewatch this broadcast, go to the Sheriff's Office website, or go to the Blue Campaign website as well.
Ms. Courtney, can you reiterate again how we can prevent some of this human trafficking?
Absolutely. So not only is it important for law enforcement, and just seeing that being on the U.S. Council and working closely with the Sheriff's Office and other great law enforcement partners, local, state, tribal, and federal, being able to disseminate information is really important between agencies, because in order to truly combat human trafficking in the way we need to, it takes a multi-agency approach. So I love that you emphasize the importance of law enforcement partnering with NGOs as well, and so I really want to highlight the incredible work, and Jacqueline Aludo is here today, who I am just so thankful for. God knew what he was doing when he brought us together and brought me onto the No Trafficking Zone team, because I will tell you, there are few people who do this work with the integrity, but also with the lived experience and the wisdom and knowledge, and it's so important. And one of the main pillars of combating trafficking and dismantling it with No Trafficking Zone is to be able to focus on prevention as well as being proactive, because whether we like it or not, so many people have already fallen into this crime, and we are so fortunate to work and walk alongside and advocate for victims when they're pursuing legal justice, when they're doing forensic interviews, and all these other kind of things. But what we eventually want to do, and as a country and as a world as a whole, if we can all get on the same page of no longer chasing this crime, but proactively getting ahead of it and getting to the root causes to truly dismantle it, then we would be able to really make the United States a no trafficking zone as a whole. And so we're really grateful for the work that we do with you guys with our Game Over initiative, with NRG Park, and with National Human Trafficking Awareness Month. I think the conversation about prevention and awareness, especially since this is National Human Trafficking Awareness Day, couldn't be more appropriate. That we really talk about the different things going on in our community leaders, our community establishments, and what can the community do for each of their communities to get involved, get informed, and be empowered to take action. And also one of the big things that will really, I think, make a huge dent and something that is really helpful for law enforcement and then being able to share and disseminate that information is increasing reporting There is so much underreporting, mass underreporting. And that's another thing too, a part of dispelling stigmas and stereotypes is I want people to understand who are either currently being trafficked, who have a loved one or someone they may know who's experiencing trafficking or something similar to trafficking, because it's in so many facets of our society, our entertainment industry, our culture, media, the news, Hollywood. It's everywhere being glorified, promoted, even if it's very distinctive and it's very subtly over the years. And part of our conversation earlier, and something I want our audience to hear about as well, is when we're talking about being programmed by a trafficker. Because we use the word and term brainwashing, which is very correct as well, honestly, but sometimes people can better understand that, because part of what my healing journey was, and something that I want to share as well with anybody who's experiencing this, is that we have been programmed in so many ways. I mean, TV is called television programming. Whether we know it or not, there are so many things that influence us, the music, the things we listen to, the friends we keep, all of these things. And what's so important is to use those spheres of influence to come in and to rehumanize one another, and to be able to bridge those gaps that social media may have started off, because I don't want to give them too much credit, because probably not, started off as a harmless way to connect people. But you know what the devil does in our world is he inverts everything good. And now social media is being used in horrific ways, and that is one of the tools that we can also use to promote awareness, and take tools traffickers use to traffic and prey upon victims, we can use to promote awareness like we are doing today.
Definitely. See something, say something is a lot that matters
Yes.
to the Harris County Sheriff's Office.
Yes. How can we prevent someone from being trafficked?
So education is so important, and so that's another really important collaboration that we do with law enforcement, with teachers, schools, community partners, other NGOs, ones with integrity, is to be able to go into the different communities, assessing what are the needs. And this isn't a ideal situation, but obviously this crime is so out of control, as it has been for centuries in all different kinds of ways. Slavery and human trafficking has been taking place, forced labor, but the ways that it looks, we can learn a lot of things on how to prevent it, I think, by studying cases and also looking at the gaps and how do we promote victims coming forward, and also with the prosecution side where them getting a successful conviction to be incentivized to pursue justice against their traffickers and cooperate and work with law enforcement. It doesn't fall solely on victim testimony, and the pressure isn't solely on them, but that we all work together better.
You brought up a fantastic point. A lot of the time victims feel like if they make an outcry or they come forward to law enforcement that they're going to have to be involved with the case, and that's not really the truth anymore.
We need to talk about that. Yeah.
For sure. Even if you just make an outcry, if it's an anonymous tip, we are still obligated to go and investigate that if it qualifies as human trafficking. Another thing I want to mention is that, especially for those victims who are in a legal status that makes them feel insecure or unsafe, there are multiple options for them to still reach out to us. There are T visas and U visas, which are specifically motivated to help these people who find themselves with an unsecure status, or maybe they don't have the right to work, or they're stuck here for some other means, or they feel like they have to stay for family. The T visa, though it takes some time for the process to go forward, does give them the right to work and the right to stay. It is a bit more correlated to the case itself. I believe that there is some kind of necessitated working together with law enforcement, but continued presence is a different option that is available to anyone. Once law enforcement is able to identify a survivor of trafficking, immediately they can begin an application for them. It lasts for about 2 years, and it can be done again and again, refreshed. And it gives them the same right to work, the same right to stay, makes them feel safe and secure, but there is no need to testify. They don't have to do anything more than maybe that first outcry if they ever made one.
The viewers want to know, how can they prevent human trafficking?
Yes. So one of the things, and I know I've highlighted a lot today, but when media or even the movie Taken with Liam Neeson, which I'm not knocking because trafficking happens in so many different ways. People can be abducted into a van, but something that's done that has been a disservice to the public that we want to better educate them on is that typically a lot of the times that you'll see the media portray how sex trafficking, specifically sex trafficking, it's very sensationalized where it should be balanced. All forms of trafficking should have equal priority and importance, and male and female victims and predators exist. That's another thing I wanted to touch on from what we spoke on earlier. But so for the public, getting informed, knowledge is power. And that's another thing too that I really encourage people, because even through my lived experience, I will say I would never wish what my family and I went through on my worst nightmare, on my worst enemy, and I should not be alive, and I would never want to relive it again, but I would not trade what I know now and understand now to go back to living, not realizing I had scales on my eyes in certain ways, and when God helped me to see very clearly how this is hidden in plain sight, and a lot of organized crime is in many different ways, being able to empower individuals and see something, say something is absolutely such a powerful tool, but also for them to be so educated and informed that they know sometimes that's not, like direct intervention is not always the best approach, but being able to report it to the proper trained authorities and advocates who can walk alongside with people. So for the public, also, it's so important for them to realize knowledge is power, and as hard as this issue is, and a lot of people want to bury their heads in the sand, that it's so important for us to not shy away from this, and that's one of the things that I really encourage the public to do is to, as hard as it is, imagine how hard it is for victims to live through it and go through it every day. And before this becomes personal to them by a loved one being taken or trafficked, people should realize this is already personal to all of us, and we have a obligation to our communities and our neighbors to look out for one another and help keep each other and our communities safe.
Who's being recruited? Is it adults, the kids? Are they being recruited different?
Yes, and this is where we can talk about the age, because this is a very huge point. So thank you for bringing it up. Anybody can be recruited, and that's another thing too. Is especially if you talk to my school friends and people who know me before I was trafficked, people would tell you I was the last person they would ever believe would be trafficked, and I would say that was true. On the outside. But any person of any socioeconomical background, any age group, any race, any ethnicity, anybody can become a victim of trafficking, whether they're male or female. Any individual can be at risk for being groomed into a form of exploitation or a form of human trafficking and forced labor. And that is so important for people to understand, that they should no longer think to themselves, oh, this is so far away, or this could never happen to me or someone I know, but to be equipped and proactive, and unfortunately the society we're living in, to be prepared that realistically they're gonna come in contact with something related to human trafficking at least once or multiple times in their lifetime, especially in Houston and Harris County.
Building on top of that as well, 17 and 18-year-olds, of course. A lot of the time, we have encountered with juveniles that when there are multiple young people involved in the case, that sometimes they're kind of made to go back in to recruit others, either to lighten the situation on themselves, or they don't understand the situation they're in, and that kind of makes it another gray area for them to come forward. But I also wanted to go on to something you mentioned before, where the trafficker can also be anyone.
Yes, and thank you, because that is something too, is we understand, and as much knowledge and expertise as we have, human trafficking can happen in a million different ways. It is such a complex issue. But when we are talking about that, also being able to acknowledge, so traffickers are very skilled, and a lot of them are incredibly smart and bright. They just unfortunately use their gifts for evil. And that's another thing too, is they can be so charming. And a trafficker can be anybody. It can be a coach,
traffickers don't always look the same
teacher,
as well.
and they don't look the same. And part of my lived experience is I was in fact trafficked by both males and females. I've been trafficked by a madam and by different levels and kinds of male traffickers and pimps, and we talked about the Romeo boyfriend pimp, but also the corporate CEO pimp, who may be a lawyer, who can be someone running corporate America businesses, and they are laundering the money of the women who they are trafficking or the individuals they are trafficking. And it is so highly lucrative for these people. And these traffickers, that's another reason we have to get inside of their minds and put ourselves in their shoes, not only survivor and victim shoes. They are business oriented. They are methodical. And so part of that too was them teaching victims and survivors how to evade and mislead and lie to law enforcement.
You mentioned as well, I don't remember if you had mentioned this during your story, but you mentioned that there's an effective power, not necessarily just to have some monetary gain over someone else. Because the sheriff's office, when we've had to go help people, we've dealt from super, super young teens, preteens, to someone almost in their 60s, of multiple genders.
Anybody can be trafficked.
Anyone
at
can
any
be
age.
traffickers.
It's not just a international deal. I mean, it's
Yes.
very domestic. It happens here.
Mostly domestic. Yep.
And
Mostly
again,
domestic.
yes, for us, it's mostly domestic. And again, I want to reiterate, we don't ask if your immigration status. We do not care. But it happens everywhere. It's not just sex trafficking. It's also labor. You know, the females that go get their nails done. You see, like the Asians, Chinese, that they're not getting paid the same. It's also the same as a sweatshop when it comes to getting their wages correct.
If the public is afraid that they can't really spot when someone is a trafficker, I feel like it's also more important to focus and try and spot when someone's being victimized, because the point of them being labeled as traffickers and getting away with this is that they've gotten away with it for such a very long time. For the public to kind of mire their mind with this fear or paranoia or negativity won't bring them any relief either. If you want to do something for your community, you need to be able to reach out to these organizations that we work with. They offer trainings for schools and businesses, or even your local churches or other places of worship. You need to make sure that there is some sort of safety precautions in place. Let the people in your life know that if they can't speak to someone that they know personally because of some aspect of shame, that there's always fear. There's always anonymous options. And unfortunately as well, the Sheriff's Office has had to deal with familial trafficking. It can be the people in your life, someone you don't know very well or someone you trust intimately. It can be a romantic partner, it can be a parent, it can be a sibling. The worst things can really happen, but there are resources here available that we want to keep expanding on more than just a local level.
I know people give the stigma, we have all these resources, they're adults, they know right from wrong. Maybe they want to do that and it's consensual, and it's not. They've been brainwashed. They don't know any better because they've been taught one way, and then to deprogram the way they've been programmed, it's very difficult.
It is, and that's another thing though too, and something you spoke on earlier is also one of the things that's so in public, and to have this discussion with law enforcement and advocates and NGOs and survivor leaders, is how we must do everything to not criminalize and re-victimize trafficking survivors, because there's a huge push for the legalization of prostitution and pimping, essentially. And it's horrific, and it's all under the guise of agency, empowerment. And I can meet people where they're at too, because that's another thing too. People are coming from this, and people, and how you touched on it earlier, survivor or someone who's in the life of trafficking in the game, they may seem very combative, they may seem rude, to be quite honest, but it's a self-defense mechanism, and it's also part of that programming, and it is instilled and beaten into our heads. And part of that is unfortunately reaffirmed incorrectly by similar stories that I shared earlier, when law enforcement approaches the victim and talks down to them and treats them as the criminal. That's another thing too that God really put on my heart, is to express for law enforcement to be empowered to meet survivors where they're at and also to not look down on them, but to meet them equally. And some people may not understand that because obviously a victim or a survivor or someone who's in the life is in a very different position, and environment and state at that point. But at the same time, agency is so important, and being able to have a say and advocate for themselves. And that's part of the biggest takeaway. One of the biggest takeaways is empowering victims and survivors to want to leave and exit the life. It's not always about rescue. We really try to stray away from that word, although sometimes that is absolutely needed. But a lot of the time, we want to encourage survivors, such as what I did myself, to exit the life, is self-extraction and quite literally running for my life and then getting connected to resources.
Another thing I want to mention on that, sorry for interrupting. A lot of the time too, when it comes to this idea that there's a lot of stigma,
Yes.
but there's also these extremes of super negative ideals over victims, or super positive outlooks is like this can be changed.
Right.
A lot of the times a kind of bedrock to this sort of mentality for both sides, I feel, is that there's just no capability for young people to create or think about their own agency because
Yes.
they're not getting educated, and they're not having, these more mature conversations with the people, the
And
guardians
they don't have
in their
life
lives.
experience.
They don't have
You
life
know, it's not because they're naive. Naive shouldn't be a diss. But when I was being told that, oh, you're naive, you don't know what. At 18 years old, you think you know everything when you're in that position, and because the pimps are telling you, oh, you know everything, because they want you to do what they say. So I love that you touched
There
on
needs
that.
to be
Yep.
some, for a lot of people, uncomfortable or inappropriate conversations where
With no shame and no
teenagers-
judgment. Yep.
Teenagers have to know what's going to happen.
We'd like to thank everyone for joining us. Okay, we welcome all y'all to follow us on our platforms to stay informed, on our social media platforms to stay informed with the county. Please follow us on Facebook, X, Instagram, Nextdoor, YouTube. Okay, and again, if you see something, say something. Ms. Sosa, would you please reiterate the phone numbers and websites?
Oh yes, of course. If emergencies, call 911. If you want more information, please look into the No Trafficking Zone,
Yes.
Blue Campaign, the Sheriff's Office website. The Human Trafficking Hotline has its own organization and website, humantraffickinghotline.org, with the phone number to their 24 hotline being 1-888-373-7888. If you can't call, you can text Be Free or Help to 233 and 733. Thank you so much.